There is a specific kind of silence that settles over the Owens Valley when a search operation moves from rescue to recovery. But on the morning of July 24th, 2004, the noise was deafening. Two Bell 206 jet rangers were chopping the thin air above Shepherd Pass. 3 ground teams were moving in a phalanx formation across the scree fields at 12,000 feet. And at the incident command post, a single radio channel crackled with the static of men and women trying to find a needle in a stack of granite needles. They were looking for a 26-year-old experienced hiker named Elena Rossi. They had the best technology available in 2004. They had seasoned trackers. They had desperation. And yet, the mountain was winning. This is the story of a disappearance that defied the logic of search and rescue for 16 years. It is a case study in the limitations of human sight and the unforgiving geometry of the High Sierras. To understand how Elena Rossi vanished, we must first understand the mechanism of the search itself and the precise moment the clock started ticking. It began 12 days earlier, on July 12, 2004. The trailhead at Shepherd Pass is not a welcoming place. It is a dusty, exposed scar in the landscape that demands a 4,000-foot ascent just to reach the tree line. At 6 o'clock hours, the sun was already bleaching the color out of the eastern Sierra. A silver Toyota Camry pulled into the gravel lot. The driver was Sarah Rossi. In the passenger seat sat her younger sister, Elena. The interaction was observed by a passing ranger, Thomas Halloway, who was emptying the bear-proof trash receptacles near the parking area. In his subsequent statement, Halloway noted that the 2 women appeared to be conducting a thorough gear check. This was not a casual day hike. Elena Rossi was preparing for a solo traverse of the High Sierra Trail, a route that would take her over the Great Western Divide. Elena's psychology is critical to understanding the events that followed. She was not a thrill-seeker. She was a systems analyst for a logistics firm in Sacramento. Her life was defined by order, predictability, and calculated risk. Her backpack, a blue Osprey Aerial 75, was packed with a precision that bordered on obsessive. She carried a lightweight North Face tent, a 0-degree sleeping bag, 7 days of caloric-dense food, and a topographical map she had annotated in red ink. Sarah Rossi stood by the trunk of the car. She watched her sister tighten the load lifter straps on her pack. "Check the satellite phone again," Sarah said. Elena patted the side pocket. "It's a brick, Sarah. It weighs 2 pounds and reception is spotty at best. I have the beacon. Beacon transmits position. Phone transmits voice. I prefer voice. I'll be at the Tyndall Creek Ranger Station in 48 hours. I'll sign the log. If I don't sign, you call the cavalry." Elena Rossi hugged her sister. It was a brief, firm embrace. She turned and began the ascent up the switchbacks. She moved with a steady, practiced cadence, using trekking poles to distribute the weight. Sarah waited until Elena was a blue speck against the brown switchbacks. Then she got back in the car and drove away. The timeline of the hike was rigid. July 12th, Shepherd Pass Trailhead to Anvil Camp. July 13th, Anvil Camp over Shepherd Pass, 12,000 feet, to Tyndall Creek. July 14th, Tyndall Creek to Wallace Creek. For the first 48 hours the plan held. The weather was perfect, highs in the 60s, lows in the 30s, visibility unlimited. Elena made good time. We know this because she encountered a pair of hikers descending from Mount Tyndall on the afternoon of July 13th. They described her as upbeat and strong. They noted she was wearing a bright blue hard-shell jacket. The turning point arrived on the night of July 14th. Meteorological records from the Bishop Station indicate a sudden pressure drop in the late afternoon. A low-pressure system, unseasonal and aggressive, hooked inward from the Pacific, colliding with the high-altitude cold air trapped in the Sierra basins. In the valley, it was rain. Above 10,000 feet, it was a whiteout. The blizzard struck with little warning. Temperatures plummeted to single digits. Wind speeds at the pass were clocked at 60 miles per hour. The topography of the High Sierras transforms in these conditions. landmarks disappear. The granite floor becomes slick with rime ice. The distinct trail, often just a worn groove in the rock, fills with snow and vanishes. On July 16th, Sarah Rossi sat in her kitchen in Sacramento, staring at the phone. The 48-hour window for the Tyndall Creek check-in had passed. She called the ranger station at Sequoia National Park. "My sister hasn't checked in," Sarah said. Her voice was level, but her hand gripped the receiver tight enough to whiten her knuckles. "The weather has been rough up there, ma'am," the ranger on duty replied. "Hikers often hunker down. Give it another 12 hours. Sarah waited 6. Then she drove to Independence, California. By the time she arrived at the Inyo County Sheriff's Department, the search operation was already being categorized. Detective Marcus Thorne was the search and rescue coordinator on duty. In 2004, Thorne was 32 years old, a man who approached search and rescue less like a police action and more like an engineering problem. He had a map of the Shepherd Pass zone spread out on a folding table when Sarah walked in. Thorne did not offer false hope. He looked up from the map, his eyes scanning Sarah's face, assessing her stability. "We have a confirmed log entry," Thorne said, skipping the pleasantries. He slid a photocopy across the table. It was a page from the Tyndall Creek Trail Register. The handwriting was neat, compact. July 14th, 1430, Elena Rossi, heading toward Wallace Creek, weather holding, spirits high. "That was 2 days ago," Sarah said, "before the storm." "Yes," Thorne said. "This is her last known point, the LKP. We build the radius from here." "Why aren't you up there?" "The birds are grounded," Thorne said, gesturing to the window where rain was lashing the glass. "Ceiling is too low. We can't fly in this. Ground teams are mobilizing at the trailhead, but it's a 12-hour hike just to get to the search zone." "She has a blue tent," Sarah said. "It's bright royal blue. You can't miss it against the grey rock." Thorne nodded. He wrote "blue tent" on the whiteboard behind him. He didn't tell her that in a blizzard, a blue tent covered in snow looks exactly like a grey rock covered in snow. The storm broke on the morning of July 17th. The sky cleared to a piercing, innocent blue. The operation launched immediately. It was a massive logistical undertaking. Thorne coordinated 3 distinct elements. First, the aerial reconnaissance. The California Highway Patrol provided a helicopter equipped with a FLIR, forward-looking infrared system. Second, the ground teams. 20 volunteers from the China Lake Mountain Rescue Group and Inyo SAR. Third, the canine units. Thorne established the Incident Command Post, ICP, at the Shepherd Pass trailhead. Sarah Rossi remained at the ICP, refusing to leave. She set up a folding chair near the radio operator, listening to the chatter. Quote 21. Thorne stood over the master map. He was drawing circles. Standard search protocol dictates that a lost subject will travel downhill, following the path of least resistance. But Elena was an experienced hiker. Would she stay put, or would she try to push through the storm? Sarah said. She was holding a photograph of Elena's boots. She wears Asolo hiking boots, Vibram soles, distinctive tread. Thorne took the photo. Good. If the snow melts, we look for prints. The first major hurdle was the technology. In 2024, we take high-resolution drone mapping for granted. In 2004, Thorne was relying on visual searching from a helicopter moving at 80 knots. The human eye is fallible. The brain plays tricks, completing patterns that aren't there. The FLIR system was the best hope. The thermal camera detects heat signatures. A human body, even in a hypothermic state, radiates heat against the cold background of the snow. Quote 26. Thorne keyed the mic. The limitations of the FLIR became apparent quickly. The sun heating the granite boulders created thousands of rocks, absorbed solar radiation, and glowed white-hot on the thermal screen. The operator had to distinguish between a warm rock and a warm person. It was visually exhausting work. Days 3, 4, and 5 passed in a blur of static and negative reports. The snow began to melt, revealing the harsh, jagged landscape underneath. On July 20th, the ground team radioed in. Thorne froze. Sarah stood up. Thorne ordered. The dog, a bloodhound named Buster, had picked up a trace of human scent. The team followed the dog for 2 miles into a rugged, boulder-choked canyon known as the Bighorn Plateau. The terrain was treacherous, loose talus that shifted underfoot. Sarah watched the map as Thorne moved a pin. Thorne said softly. The dog led them to a small overhang of rock. Underneath, they found a wrapper for a power bar. Thorne ordered it bagged. Sarah looked at the description read over the radio. Thorne muttered. The trail went cold at the rock overhang. The wind had scoured the plateau, erasing any scent that remained. The dog circled, whined, and sat down. By July 25th, the operation shifted gears. The urgent, frantic energy of the rescue phase bled away, replaced by the grim, methodical plodding of recovery. The survival models were clear. Without shelter or heat, in those conditions, the window of survivability was closing, if not already closed. Thorne felt the weight of it. He was a man of procedure, but the silence of the radio was a personal failure. He spent his nights reviewing the aerial photography. The photos were taken on 35mm film by a tactical flight officer leaning out of a helicopter. They were developed overnight and spread out on light tables. Grainy, high contrast, shadows that looked like crevices that looked like bodies. Sarah asked on the 10th day. She looked hollowed out, her eyes dark circles of exhaustion. Thorne said, "This was the defining constraint of the 2004 search. The entire operation relied on line of sight. If Elena was wedged between 2 boulders, or if her blue tent had collapsed and was covered by a dusting of rockfall or snow, she was effectively gone. The High Sierras are vast. A search grid of 10 square miles contains millions of potential hiding spots. On August 2nd, 14 days after the search began, the team got the break they had been praying for, or so they thought. A hiker near Shepherd Pass, completely unconnected to the search, flagged down a ground team. He handed them a blue Nalgene water bottle he had found wedged in a crevice near the trail, about 3 miles below the summit. The radio call came into the ICP at 1400 hours. Sarah gasped. Thorne grabbed the mic. There was a pause. The static hissed. Thorne said, "The discovery of the bottle revitalized the search for 24 hours. Thorne shifted the entire grid downhill, assuming Elena had turned back and fallen near the 10,000 foot mark. They scoured the drainage. They rappelled down the cliffs. Nothing. When the bottle arrived at the ICP that evening, Sarah Rossi took one look at it and shook her head. She said, her voice cracking. Thorne took the bottle. He turned it over. Stamped on the bottom was a manufacturing date. May 2004. It was new, but it was generic. A piece of trash dropped by any of the hundreds of hikers who passed through in June or July. It was a false lead, a coincidence of colour and plastic. The next morning, August 5th, the county sheriff arrived at the incident command post. He called Thorne aside. They spoke in low tones near the map table. Sarah watched them from her chair. She knew what was happening by the posture of the men. Thorne's shoulders slumped. He nodded once, slowly. Thorne walked over to Sarah. He removed his hat. He began. She said. Thorne corrected. Sarah said. She stood up, her voice rising for the first time in 2 weeks. Thorne said, and he meant it. That was the torture of his profession, knowing the subject is within the radius, but being blind to the specific coordinate. The helicopters were grounded, the tents at base camp were struck. The volunteers packed their gear, their faces somber. The noise of the operation faded, replaced once again by the wind moving through the sagebrush. Sarah Rossi stood at the trailhead as the last truck pulled out. She looked up at the jagged skyline of the Sierras. Somewhere up there, amidst the grey granite and the white snow, was a speck of royal blue. The file on Elena Rossi was placed in a cabinet in Independence, marked Suspended. Inside was the logbook page, the map of the search grid, and the plastic bag containing the generic blue water bottle that belonged to a stranger. The year 2004 ended. The snows came and buried the high country deep, sealing whatever secrets remained on the plateau. Technology stalled. The resolution of the world remained grainy. It would take 12 years, a revolution in satellite imaging, and the obsession of a man named Dr. Aris Vala to turn that grain into a picture. But for now, the mountain held its silence. The search was over. The wait had begun. Sarah Rossi did not leave immediately. She sat in her rental sedan, a grey Ford that smelled of stale lemon cleaner and other people's cigarettes, and watched the dust settle on the gravel lot. The silence that descended was absolute, a physical weight that pressed against the windows. The frenetic energy of the search, the static burst of radios, the idling diesel engines, the organized shouting of grid coordinates, had created a temporary city in the wilderness. Now, that city was dismantled, leaving only the indifference of the high desert. She turned the key in the ignition, but her hand shook so violently she had to stop. She gripped the steering wheel, staring at her knuckles turning white, breathing through her nose. If she released the brake, if she put the car in drive and rolled down the Onion Valley Road toward Independence, she was admitting that Elena was part of the landscape now. Leaving meant accepting the past tense. Elena was. It took an hour before she could move. When she finally descended the switchbacks, the sun was dipping behind the crest, casting the Owens Valley in a long violet shadow. The jagged teeth of the Kearsarge Pass glowed orange, mocking and beautiful, holding their secret tight against the coming night. In the weeks that followed, the official machinery of the search wound down with bureaucratic efficiency. Detective Thorne returned to his desk in the sheriff's substation, a small room with linoleum floors that had been peeling since the late 90s. He spent the first 3 days just staring at the file. The suspended stamp was not a conclusion. It was a purgatory. He knew the statistics. He knew that after 72 hours, a search became a recovery. After 2 weeks, a recovery became a mystery. After a month, it became a ghost story. He kept the topographic map pinned to the wall behind his monitor. It was covered in grease pencil markings, red for searched sectors, black for hazardous terrain, blue for water sources. The blue markings taunted him. He had walked those drainage lines himself. He had crawled through manzanita thickets so dense they tore his uniform. He had stood on the granite shelves overlooking the lakes, scanning with high-powered binoculars until his eyes watered and the grey rock began to hallucinate shapes. In October, before the first heavy snows closed the pass, Thorne went back up on his day off. He didn't check out a radio. He didn't log his route. He parked his personal truck at the trailhead and hiked up to the bench where the Nalgene bottle had been found. He sat there for 4 hours, listening to the wind hiss through the foxtail pines. He was looking for carrion birds. He was looking for the flash of synthetic fabric that didn't belong in nature's palette. He saw nothing but the indifferent majesty of the mountains. The wilderness did not care about justice, and it certainly did not care about closure. When he hiked back down, his knees aching and his chest heavy, he took the map off his wall and folded it into the back of the file. He didn't look at it again for 5 years. For Sarah, the timeline was different. Time did not heal, it merely calcified. She returned to her apartment in San Francisco, but the city felt loud and frivolous. The concerns of her colleagues, deadlines, happy hours, rent increases, seemed to be spoken in a foreign language. She kept her phone on her nightstand, sound on high, charging cord attached. Every unknown number was a jolt of adrenaline that left her sick and trembling when it turned out to be a telemarketer or a wrong number. She began to frequent the online forums. In 2005, the internet was a wilder, less centralized place, a collection of message boards and primitive chat rooms. She found a community of the lost, families of the missing, amateur sleuths, and conspiracy theorists. She posted Elena's flyer on web sleuths, on hiking forums, on the digital bulletin boards of climbing gyms. Missing. Elena Rossi, 26 years old, last seen wearing a royal blue windbreaker. The responses were a mixture of kindness and cruelty. Strangers offered prayers. Psychics offered visions of dark caves and running water, vague enough to apply to anywhere in the Sierras. Trolls suggested Elena had run away, or worse, that Sarah herself was involved. She read them all. She drank the poison of the comments section because it was the only place Elena still existed in the present tense. The seasons turned. The snowpack of 2005 was historic, burying the trails under 30 feet of white powder. Avalanches scoured the gullies, rearranging the geography of the slopes. Trees were snapped like matchsticks. Boulders the size of cars trundled down into the valleys. If there had been footprints, they were gone. If there had been a body, it was being ground into the geology of the range. 2006 came and went. Sarah stopped calling Thorn. There was nothing to say. In 2007, the first iPhone was released. The resolution of the world began to sharpen. People carried cameras in their pockets. They geotagged their photos. The data stream of humanity exploded, but the High Sierra remained a dead zone, a place of analog silence in a rapidly digitizing world. Thorn retired in 2009. The department threw him a party at the VFW hall. There was sheet cake and lukewarm beer. The new sheriff, a younger man named Ramirez, who relied more on data analytics than gut instinct, shook his hand and thanked him for his service. Thorn cleared out his desk. He took a box of personal effects, photos of his ex-wife, a stress ball, a coffee mug, and at the last moment, he opened the filing cabinet. He pulled the copy of the Rossi file. It was technically against protocol, but no one was watching. No one cared about a 5-year-old cold case in a jurisdiction that covered 10,000 square miles of nothing. He took it home and put it in a box in his garage, next to his fishing gear. The world moved on. The financial crisis hit, governments toppled, the ice caps melted, and through it all, Elena Rossi remained missing. She became a cautionary tale told to hikers at the trailhead. Don't go off trail. Don't go alone. Remember the girl who vanished? But while the physical search had ended, a virtual one was unknowingly being born. The revolution started quietly, in the server farms of Silicon Valley and the orbital paths of commercial satellites. Companies like Google and Digital Globe were stitching together a quilt of the entire planet. At first, the imagery was blurry, a mosaic of green and brown blobs. You could see a city, but not a house. You could see a mountain range, but not a trail. Then came the update of 2012. The resolution jumped. Suddenly, you could distinguish a car from a truck. You could count the trees in a park. The quote 64 was no longer just a picture. It was a data set. It was in this new era that Dr. Aris Valla found his calling. Valla was not a detective. He was not a hiker. He was a computational physicist who had burned out of academia after a dispute regarding the statistical modeling of dark matter distribution. He was a man who preferred the company of algorithms to people. He lived in a loft in Seattle that was more server room than apartment, cooled by humming industrial fans and lit by the glow of 6 4K monitors arranged in a semicircle around his ergonomic chair. Valla's obsession was he wrote scripts that crawled over satellite imagery, looking for things that didn't fit the fractal patterns of nature. He had started by hunting for looting pits in archaeological sites in Peru, identifying the distinct shadow patterns of shovel holes from space. Then, he had moved on to counting walrus populations in the Arctic for a climate change non-profit. He saw the world as a matrix of pixels. Nature was chaotic, but it possessed a mathematical consistency. Trees grew in certain distributions. Water flowed according to gravity. Rock eroded in fractal geometries. Humans, however, were geometric interlopers. Humans made straight lines. Humans created right angles. Humans introduced colors, bright blues, oranges, reds, that did not exist in the high-altitude spectrum. In late 2015, Valla was contracted by a private firm to test a new image recognition neural network. They wanted to see if the AI could identify foreign objects in wilderness areas, downed plains, illegal marijuana grows, unauthorized structures. They gave him a data set, the entire Sierra Nevada range, imaged in high resolution during the summer of 2014. Valla fed the terabytes of data into his system. He trained the AI to ignore grey granite, white snow, and green pine. He taught it to flag anything that broke the color curve. For months, the system churned. It found thousands of false positives, a patch of lichen that looked like a tent, a trick of the light on a wet rock that looked like a windshield, a discarded mylar balloon caught in a tree. Vala sat in his dark room, drinking espresso, clicking reject on image after image. It was a digital search, a grid search performed at the speed of light, but it was just as tedious as walking through the sagebrush. Then he began to refine the parameters. He grew bored with the contract work and started following his own curiosity. He stumbled upon the Charlie Project database, a repository of missing persons cases. He read about the hikers who had walked into the woods and never walked out. He read about the zone of silence. He read about Elena Rossi. The story hooked him. Not because of the tragedy, Vala was not a sentimental man, but because of the specifics. The description of her gear. Royal blue windbreaker. North Face backpack, grey with orange trim. Blue and orange. High contrast. He pulled the specific satellite tiles for the area around the Kearsarge Pass. The imagery from 2014 was good, but he wanted better. He used his credentials to access the raw archives of the WorldView 3 satellite. He requested the spectral bands, not just visible light, but near-infrared. Synthetic materials reflected infrared light differently than organic matter. A nylon jacket had a specific spectral signature. He was looking for a needle in a haystack, but he had a magnet. It was a rainy Tuesday in November 2016 when the algorithm pinged. Vala was asleep in his chair, a half-eaten bagel on the desk. The alert sound, a soft digital chime, woke him. He rubbed his eyes and looked at screen 3. The system had flagged a cluster of pixels in Sector 44 North, grid reference 7. It was an area known as the Goblin's Garden, a chaotic field of talus and scree at the base of a sheer granite cliff, 3 miles off the main trail. It was terrain so rugged that even the bighorn sheep avoided it. Vala zoomed in. The image pixelated, then resolved. To the untrained eye it was nothing, a shadow among shadows, a grey smudge in a field of grey smudges. But Vala switched the view to the false colour infrared layer. The grey smudge glowed hot pink. It was synthetic. He switched back to the visual spectrum. He ran a sharpening algorithm, enhancing the edges, correcting for atmospheric distortion. He leaned in, his nose inches from the screen. There, wedged into a crevice between 2 house-sized boulders, half buried by a decade of rockfall, was a speck of unnatural blue. And next to it, the bleached, white curve of something that looked disturbingly like bone, though it could have been a tree branch. Vala's heart rate, usually a steady 60 beats per minute, spiked. He sat back. He checked the coordinates. He cross-referenced the location with the search and rescue maps from 2004, which he had dug up from a deeply buried PDF on a county server. The search grid had ended 2,000 feet to the east. The Goblin's Garden had been deemed low probability due to the extreme difficulty of access. They had flown over it, sure, but from a helicopter moving at 80 knots, looking down into a kaleidoscope of broken rock, a small blue object in a shadow would have been invisible. But the satellite didn't blink. The satellite didn't get tired. The satellite stared straight down, capturing a moment in time with absolute indifference. Vala took a screenshot. He picked up his phone. He didn't know Sarah Rossi. He didn't know Detective Thorne. But he knew he had just solved a puzzle that had defeated time itself. He hesitated. He was a scientist, not a cop. What if it was just a backpack dropped by a climber? What if it was a tarp? He needed verification. He needed eyes on the ground. He searched for the Inyo County Sheriff's Department number. Then he paused. He looked up the name of the officer who had originally handled the case, mentioned in the old news articles. Detective J. Thorne. A quick people search database query located a generic address in Lone Pine, 20 miles south of Independence. A landline number. Vala dialed. The phone rang 4 times. Hello? The voice was raspy, older than Vala expected. "Is this Mr. Thorne, formerly Detective Thorne?" A pause. The wariness was audible. "Who's asking?" "My name is Dr. Aris Vala. I'm calling from Seattle. I analyze satellite imagery for a living." "I don't need any solar panels, son." "No, wait. Don't hang up. I'm looking at a set of coordinates in the John Muir Wilderness, near the Kearsarge Pass." The line went silent. The static of the connection hissed. "Go on," Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave. "I have a spectral signature match for a specific shade of royal blue nylon. It's located in a talus field at elevation 11,400 feet. It matches the description of Elena Rossi's jacket." Silence again, long and heavy. "That's impossible," Thorne whispered. "We flew that grid." "You flew it with human eyes," Vala said, his voice clinical but intense. "I'm looking at it with a multispectral sensor from orbit. The object is there, Mr. Thorne. It's been there for 12 years. "Where?" Thorne asked. The word was a demand, a plea, and a prayer all at once. "Do you have a pen?" Vala read the coordinates, latitude, longitude, down to the 4th decimal point. "I can email you the image," Vala added. "I don't have email," Thorne lied. Or maybe he just didn't want to see it on a screen. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. Thorne said. Thorne hung up the phone and sat in his kitchen. The linoleum was still peeling. The coffee in his mug was cold. He looked at his hands. They were spotted with age now, the knuckles swollen with arthritis. But the tremor that had been there for years, the subtle shake of unfinished business, was gone. He was rock steady. He stood up and walked to the garage. He pulled the box off the shelf. He dusted off the file. He opened it to the map. He found the Goblin's Garden, a swirl of tight contour lines indicating a steep, unforgiving hellscape. He took a red pen and marked an X where Vala had directed him. It was a mile outside their search perimeter, just 1 mile. A 20-minute walk on flat ground, an eternity in that terrain. He called Sarah Rossi next. She was in a meeting when her phone buzzed. She almost ignored it. It was a number she didn't recognize, but the area code, 760, stopped her breath. It was the code for the Owens Valley. She stepped out of the conference room, her heels clicking on the polished concrete of the modern office. "Hello?" "Sarah, it's Jim Thorne." The name hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't heard his voice in nearly a decade. She leaned against the glass wall, looking out at the foggy San Francisco skyline. Thorne paused. Sarah slid down the glass wall until she was sitting on the floor. The office hummed around her, oblivious. Thorne said, she said. Thorne said gently. The drive down was a blur. The years peeled away with the miles. The Central Valley, the windmills of Mojave, the turn north onto 395. The landscape hadn't changed. The mountains were exactly as she left them, stoic, brutal, magnificent. She arrived at the Onion Valley trailhead at dawn. Thorne was there, leaning against a truck that was newer than the one she remembered. He looked older, greyer, slightly shrunken inside his jacket, but his eyes were sharp. There were 3 other men with him, young deputies with strong backs and coils of climbing rope strapped to their packs. They looked at Sarah with a mixture of pity and respect. They knew the story. It was the department's legend. "We'll radio," Thorne said. He didn't offer false promises. He didn't hug her. He just nodded. Sarah watched them go. She watched them hike up the switchbacks until they were just ants crawling on the face of a giant. Then she sat on the bumper of her car and waited. The wait was different this time. In 2004, the wait had been frantic, filled with the noise of hope. This wait was silent. It was a vigil. High above, the team moved slowly. Thorne found that his lungs weren't what they used to be. The altitude hammered him. But he kept pace, fueled by a singular, burning need to know. They reached the plateau. They turned off the trail. They began the scramble into the Goblin's Garden. The terrain was a nightmare, loose rock that shifted underfoot, house-sized boulders balanced precariously on scree. They checked the GPS. They checked the printout of the satellite image Vala had sent to the sheriff. One of the deputies said, Thorn moved to the front. He scrambled over a granite slab, his working one of the guard. They shamed underpeered his might. The Ganley that the struggles Christ. He looked down into the crevice. The sun was high now, illuminating the shadows that usually hid the bottom of the fissure. Thorn stopped. He let out a breath that shuddered through his entire body. It was there. The blue was faded, bleached by 12 years of UV radiation, but it was unmistakably a windbreaker. It was shredded, caught under a rockfall that must have happened years ago, or perhaps the fall itself had triggered it. And there was the pack. And there, undisturbed by predators because of the tomb-like nature of the rocks, were the remains. Thorn keyed his radio. His hand was shaking again, but this time it was relief. Quote 113, quote. The crackle of the radio was the only sound in the world. Quote 115. Down at the trailhead, Sarah heard the squawk from the radio in the sheriff's truck parked nearby. She didn't hear the words, just the tone of the voice. She stood up. Thorn looked down at the remains of Elena Rossi. She hadn't gone far. She hadn't been abducted. She hadn't run away. She had simply slipped. A misplaced step, a loose rock, a fall into a place where the world couldn't see her, until the world changed enough to look. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sealed plastic bag. Inside was a generic blue Nalgene bottle cap he had kept in his desk for years, a reminder of the false lead. He looked at it, then at the blue jacket. He whispered to the wind. He looked up at the sky. Somewhere up there, a satellite was whizzing by at 17,000 miles an hour, a silent, robotic eye that had finally blinked at the right moment. Thorn turned to the young deputies. The procession down the mountain took 6 hours. The sun was setting again, painting the peaks in the same violet light as that day in 2004. Sarah stood by the trailhead sign. She saw them coming, a line of dark figures against the twilight, carrying a stretcher. Thorn walked ahead. He reached the pavement and walked straight to Sarah. He didn't say a word. He just took off his hat and held it against his chest. Sarah looked past him to the shrouded shape on the stretcher. She didn't cry. She had cried all her tears a decade ago. She felt a strange, hollow lightness, as if a heavy stone she had been carrying had finally been set down. Thorn said softly. Sarah nodded. She looked up at the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. The resolution of the universe was infinite, pixel by pixel, star by star. She said. The wind kicked up, rustling the sagebrush, blowing the dust across the parking lot. The mountain stood silent, its secret finally told, returning to its ancient, indifferent slumber. The search was over. The wait was over. The long walk home had begun. Marcus Thorn pressed the print key on his desktop keyboard, the sound of the mechanical switch echoing in the quiet bullpen. The printer in the corner whirred to life, spitting out 3 sheets of paper. They were warm to the touch. He picked them up, aligned the edges on his desk, and picked up the red rubber stamp from the tray. He didn't hesitate. He brought the stamp down with a dull thud. It was January 14th, 2005. 3 months had passed since the blizzard that swallowed the High Sierras. The primary search phase was officially over. The budget authorization had expired at midnight. Thorn picked up the cardboard banker's box labeled Rossi, Elena, case number 04-922. He placed the freshly stamped status update on top of the stack of topographical maps and witness statements. He folded the lid flaps down, interlocking them. The cardboard scraped against itself. He stood up, walked to the metal shelving unit at the back of the room, and slid the box into the gap between a solved domestic homicide and a lingering arson investigation. He stared at the label. In the box was the sum total of a life reduced to coordinates and negative results. There was the Nalgene bottle cap found near Shepherd Pass, a generic blue screw top that matched thousands of bottles sold that year. It was their only physical lead, and it had led nowhere. There were the transcripts of the 2 helicopter pilots who had flown grid patterns until their fuel gauges flashed red. They were the Tyndall Creek logbook photocopies. That it? Thorne turned. Sheriff Miller stood in the doorway holding a fresh mug of coffee. That's it, Thorne said. Snowpack is at 180% of average. If she's up there, she's under 20 feet of concrete hard ice. We wait for the thaw. Sarah Rossi is in the lobby, Miller said. He didn't look happy about it. Thorne grabbed his hat. Thorne walked past the sheriff, down the linoleum hallway, and into the lobby. Sarah Rossi was standing by the bulletin board, rearranging a thumbtack on a flyer that was already perfectly straight. She looked thinner than she had in November. Her movements were sharp, energized by a lack of sleep. Sarah said the moment she saw him. She didn't say hello. She opened a binder she was carrying. I've been looking at the drainages. If she got turned around near the Bighorn Plateau, she could have dropped into the Kern Trench earlier than we thought. Thorne stopped 3 feet from her. He kept his hands at his sides. Sarah. She didn't look up from her binder. She froze. Her finger remained on the map, pressing down on a contour line until the nail bed turned white. She slowly looked up. Her eyes were dry, red-rimmed, and terrifyingly clear. She repeated. Thorne said. He used the word recovery deliberately. He watched her flinch, but she didn't break. I'm not asking for your deputies, Sarah said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming entirely flat. I'm telling you where I'm going to send the volunteers. You can't send civilians up there in January. I'm planning for June, she said. She closed the binder with a snap. And I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you so you can update your file. You do have a file, don't you? I do. Good. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. Don't lose it. The phone on Thorne's desk rang at 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. It was the Bishop Police Department. A patrol sergeant Thorne knew from joint training exercises. Marcus, the sergeant said, we got a call. Waitress at the Holy Smoke barbecue said she saw a woman matching the Rossi flyer. Said she came in, bought a side of fries, paid cash, didn't talk. Thorne felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the adrenaline spike he had learned to distrust. Description? 5'5", dark hair, athletic build. Said she looked weathered, carrying an Osprey pack, blue. Elena Rossi had carried a blue Osprey. Did they get a direction of travel? South on Route 395. Hitchhiking. Thorne looked at the calendar. It had been 2 years. The psychological profile suggested Elena Rossi was stable, employed, and close to her family. She wasn't a runaway. But the mountains changed people. Trauma changed people. He had seen hikers walk out of the wilderness with 1,000-yard stares, unable to reintegrate into the noise of civilization. Thorne said, the drive to Bishop took 2 hours. Thorne spent the time reviewing the mental inventory of Elena's gear. The boots, a Solo, size 8. The jacket, North Face, Gore-Tex, light blue. The dental records, a distinct crown on the lower left molar. When he arrived at the station, the sergeant had the VHS tape queued up on a small monitor. Thorne stood close to the screen, watching the grainy black and white footage. The timestamp read 11:42 a.m. The door opened. A figure walked in. Female. Backpack. She moved with a heavy, tired gait. She sat at the counter. Thorne watched the way she took the pack off. She swung it by one strap. Thorne said. The image froze. The static jittered. Thorne leaned in. The sergeant adjusted the focus. The pixels expanded, blurring the edges. Thorne said. The sergeant offered. The woman on the screen shifted her weight. She was wearing canvas approach shoes, not heavy hiking boots, but it was the face that mattered. She turned toward the register to pay. The camera angle was high, looking down. Thorne studied the nose, the jawline. It was similar, strikingly similar. But Elena Rossi had a small scar above her right eyebrow from a childhood bicycle accident. The resolution was too low to see a scar, but the shape of the ear was distinct. Elena's ears were small, flat against her head. This woman's ears were slightly more prominent. Thorne said softly. Thorne repeated, straightening up. He had his office in silence. He didn't call Sarah. He had made a rule early on: never call Sarah with a maybe, only call her with a yes. The dust on the Kern Plateau was fine and alkaline. It coated the back of the throat and stung the eyes. It was the 5th consecutive summer of the Rossi Sweep, a volunteer operation funded and organized entirely by the Rossi family. Sarah stood at the trailhead of the Horseshoe Meadow, holding a clipboard. She was 32 now. The softness of her 20s had evaporated, replaced by a lean, hardened efficiency. She wore a radio harness on her chest and held a GPS unit in her left hand. 40 volunteers stood in a semicircle around her. They were a mix of weekend warriors, retired SAR personnel, and friends of the family. "Today we are gridding the Whitney Creek drainage," Sarah announced. Her voice carried over the wind without shouting. "We are looking for synthetic materials: blue nylon, orange plastic, metal. Nature doesn't make straight lines. If you see a straight line, you call it in." Thorne stood at the back of the group, leaning against his department SUV. He was technically off duty, but he came every year. He told himself it was to ensure safety protocols were followed. In reality, he came because he couldn't sit at home while they looked for the ghost that lived in his filing cabinet. The searchers moved out, spacing themselves 20 feet apart. They moved like a comb through the sagebrush and foxtail pines. Thorne walked with the flank team. The terrain was brutal, a high-altitude desert of granite slabs and loose scree. The altitude was over 10,000 feet. Every step was a negotiation with gravity and oxygen deprivation. Sarah said. She had appeared beside him, matching his pace. Thorne looked up. He heard a faint buzzing, like an angry hornet. They walked in silence for 10 minutes. The only sounds were the crunch of boots on gravel and the static of the radios. Sarah said suddenly. Thorne didn't break stride. "The Millers? From San Diego. They divorced. I tracked the husband down in Oregon. He remembered something he didn't put in the statement in 2004. Memory is fluid, Sarah. It degrades. He said he saw someone setting up a tent near the frog ponds, not the main campground, the ponds to the east. The frog ponds are off-trail, illegal camping. Exactly. Elena respected the rules, but if the storm was coming in fast and she was exhausted, maybe she hunkered down early. Maybe she didn't try to make the pass. Thorne stopped. He looked east, toward the jagged ridge that separated the plateau from the steep drop-off into the Owens Valley. The frog ponds were a cluster of small, stagnant pools nestled in a granite bowl. If she had camped there and the snow hit, she would have been buried in a depression. We searched the ponds in 2005, Thorne said. We searched the perimeter, Sarah corrected. The water level is lower this year. It's a drought year. Thorne looked at her. He saw the desperation masked as logic, but he also saw the possibility. I'll take a team, Thorne said. We'll sweep the bowl. They spent 6 hours at the frog ponds. They raked the mud. They sifted the sediment. They found a rusted tent stake. Thorne bagged it, his heart hammering for a brief moment. He cleaned it off with his thumb. It was steel, heavy, old school, not the lightweight aluminum Elena carried. It was trash from the 70s. When he showed it to Sarah, she didn't sigh. She just nodded, logged the GPS coordinate of the find in her database, and turned back to the map. She said, the box on Thorne's desk had changed. It was no longer cardboard. It was a flat, sleek computer monitor. The department had upgraded to a new digital evidence management system. Thorne was spending his evenings scanning the old paper files. Every witness statement, every map, every weather report was being converted into zeros and ones. He opened the software. ArcGIS. It was a revelation. For years, Thorne had worked with flat paper maps, trying to visualize the terrain in 3D in his mind. Now, he could tilt the landscape. He could simulate lighting conditions. He could drape satellite imagery over the topography. He loaded the Rossi_last_known layer. A red dot appeared at the junction of the John Muir Trail and the High Sierra Trail. He loaded the search for layer. A mesh of translucent green squares overlaid the mountains. He zoomed in. The mouse wheel clicked. The landscape rushed toward him. He toggled the view to show the slope gradient. The map turned into a heat map of danger. Green was flat, yellow was steep, red was vertical. Thorne stared at the screen. He traced the route Elena had intended to take. It cut across a yellow band, the traverse below the ridgeline. Computer, he muttered to himself. Show view shed from point A. The software calculated which areas were visible from the trail and which were hidden by the curvature of the earth or rock outcroppings. Shadow zones appeared in grey. There were so many grey zones. Ravines, couloirs, pockets behind boulders. The helicopter pilots in 2004 had done their best, but they couldn't see through rock. Thorne realized with a sinking feeling that despite 7 years of searching, they had visually cleared less than 60% of the actual surface area of the search zone. The complexity of the High Sierras masked its secrets well. He picked up the phone and dialed Sarah. He said. When Sarah arrived, she brought a hard drive. Thorne asked. She said. They sat together in front of the screen. Thorne showed her the viewshed analysis. Sarah said, pointing. Thorne said. Sarah said. She said. Thorne looked at her. This was the evolution of the investigation. It was moving away from him, away from badges and warrants, and into the cloud. He said. The coffee shop in Lone Pine was crowded with tourists heading up to Mount Whitney. Thorne sat in a booth in the back, opposite a man named David Kellerman. Kellerman was 55 now, balding, with sun-damaged skin. He was the hiker from the Tyndall Creek logbook, the one Sarah had tracked down 3 years prior, the one who had mentioned the tent near the frog ponds. Thorne had decided to re-interview him personally. The quote, 204 lead had been a bust, but something about the statement nagged at him. Kellerman closed his eyes. He took a sip of his coffee. Kellerman paused, his brow furrowed. Thorne wrote in his notebook. Elena's tent was a Sierra Designs clip flashlight, the 2004 model. Thorne pulled a catalogue photo from his folder and slid it across the table. Kellerman looked at the photo. The tent in the picture was blue and yellow, Kellerman said. Thorne pulled out another photo. This one showed a black diamond first light. Thorne sat back. A boxy, all-electric blue structure. Thorne said slowly. Kellerman blinked. Kellerman went pale. He put his coffee cup down. The ceramic rattled against the saucer. Kellerman whispered. Thorne felt the chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The witness hadn't seen a camp. He had seen a casualty, and he had walked past, thinking it was a camper waiting out the storm. Can you point to the spot on the map? Thorne pushed the tablet across the table. Kellerman's finger trembled as he pointed to a cluster of boulders 300 yards south of the frog ponds, a place they hadn't searched in 2009 because it was technically outside the logical camping zone. Kellerman said. Thorne stood in the server room of the Rossi Project's headquarters, which was actually the converted garage of Sarah's home in Sacramento. The walls were covered in printed maps. The hum of cooling fans filled the air. We have a problem, Sarah said. She was typing furiously on a dual monitor setup. The Kellerman coordinates? We swept them last week. The volunteer team searched that boulder field grid by grid. Nothing. Thorne sighed, leaning against a rack of hard drives. 10 years, Sarah. The scavengers, the wind, the snow load, things move. A body doesn't move uphill, she snapped, and gear doesn't just vanish. It gets buried, or it decomposes. Nylon breaks down in UV light. Not this fast, not completely. She spun her chair around. We're missing something fundamental. We're looking at the ground, Marcus. We're walking over it, but the terrain is too complex. We need to strip the terrain away. How? I met someone, Sarah said, at a conference in San Francisco, a geologist named Dr. Aris Vala. He works with satellite imagery for mining exploration, spectral analysis. Mining? He uses satellites to find specific mineral signatures in rock, copper, lithium, gold. He says every material has a spectral fingerprint, not just color, the way it reflects infrared light. And you want him to look for, what, Gore-Tex? Exactly. Gore-Tex reflects light differently than granite. Nylon reflects differently than limestone. If we can get the archival satellite data from 2004 or 2005, Dr. Valla thinks he can write an algorithm to filter out the rocks and snow and leave only the synthetic signatures. Thorne rubbed his temples. This sounds like science fiction, Sarah. It's science fact. The problem is the resolution. Commercial satellites in 2004 were low-res. 1 pixel covered a 10 by 10 meter square. Elena is smaller than a pixel. So it's useless. Not necessarily. Valla says if the material is bright enough or reflective enough, it can create a sub-pixel anomaly. It alters the color value of the whole pixel, even if you can't see the object itself. Thorne looked at the maps on the wall. The search had become abstract. They were no longer hunting for a sister. They were hunting for a math error in a grid of digital noise. "Bring him in," Thorne said. Doctor.
Aris Valla was not what Thorne expected. He was young, barely 30, wearing a hoodie and expensive sneakers. He didn't look like a geologist. He looked like a coder. They met in Thorne's office. The file box was on the desk, the physical anchor to the digital conversation. Valla said, shaking hands. His grip was firm. Thorne said. Valla smiled thinly. Valla opened his laptop. He connected it to the large monitor on the wall. The screen filled with a patchwork of grey and white squares. It looked like a blurry video game from the 90s. Thorne said. Valla said. Valla began typing command lines. Greater than load filter. Spectral ask. Beat 400 subtract left. Snow albedo high. The image on the screen changed in the panel. The image is longly overhead. Snow albedo high. The image on the screen changed. The white snow turned black. The grey rocks turned dark blue. Valla explained. The screen went almost entirely black. It was a void. Valla said. Thorne watched, holding his breath. He didn't believe it would work. It was too clean. Real police work was messy. Valla hit enter. The black screen remained black. Nothing, Thorne said. Wait, it's processing the entire search grid, 300 square miles. A minute passed. The cooling fan on Valla's laptop whined. Then a single dot appeared. It wasn't in the bowl where Kellerman had pointed. It wasn't on the trail. It wasn't in the drainage. It was high up, impossibly high, near the ridgeline of the precipice that dropped into the neighboring valley, a place no hiker would go willingly. What is that? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Valla moved the cursor. He zoomed in. The dot remained a single, stubborn, cyan-coloured square in a sea of blackness. Coordinate 36.578, negative 118.331, Valla read. Elevation 12,400 feet. That's a cliff band, Thorne said. She couldn't be there. The spectral signature is distinct, Valla said. It's not rock. It's not ice. It's blue nylon mixed with snow. Thorne stared at the pixel. It was just a square of light, but in the silence of the office, it felt heavy. It felt like mass. Can you cross-reference this with the 2005 imagery? Thorne asked. Doing it now. Valla loaded the next dataset. August 2005. The dot was still there. Fainter, but there. 2006, Thorne ordered. The dot was gone. It moved? Sarah asked. Or it was covered, Valla said. Rockfall. Or it slid down. Thorne looked at the coordinates again. He pulled out the physical topographical map. He located the spot. It was a steep scree slope beneath a jagged spire, miles off the intended route. But if she had become hypothermic, if she had been disoriented by the whiteout, she could have walked upward, seeking high ground, seeking a signal, seeking God knows what. That pixel, Thorne said, pointing to the screen, that was visible in 2004? Yes, Valla said. It was in the public archive for 11 years. Anyone could have downloaded it. But no one knew how to look, Sarah whispered. Thorne stood up. He walked to the window. The mountains were out there in the distance, hazy in the heat. "It's a pixel, Sarah. It's not a body. It could be a balloon. It could be a dropped pack cover." "It's her," Sarah said. She was crying now, silent tears running down her cheeks. She was right there, all this time. Thorne turned back to the screen. He looked at the single blue pixel, glowing in the darkness of the monitor. It was a digital tombstone. "Print the coordinates," Thorne said. "We're going back up." Vala hit a key. The printer whirred to life, just as it had in 2005. But this time, it wasn't printing a closure status. It was printing a destination. Thorne picked up the paper. The ink was fresh. 300, Thorne said. 301. The search wasn't over. The recovery was just beginning. The transition from the sterile, climate-controlled silence of the analysis room to the staging garage was jarring. Thorne moved with a mechanical efficiency that he had honed over 2 decades of search and rescue, but his hands felt different this time, heavier. Every buckle he fastened on his pack, every carabiner he clipped to his harness, carried the weight of a decade-long failure. Sarah stood by the workbench watching him. She hadn't moved to get her own gear yet. She was staring at the printout, the paper trembling slightly in her grip. The single cyan pixel was grainy and indistinct on the page, stripped of the monitor's backlighting, but to her it was a photograph of a ghost. Thorne said, his voice low, but cutting through the hum of the overhead halogen lights. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but clearing. She nodded, once, a sharp, jerky motion. She hesitated, shoving a fleece pullover into her compression sack. Thorne paused, holding a coil of static rope. He didn't want to answer, but he owed her the truth, or at least the version of the truth that allowed them to put one foot in front of the other. "Nylon lasts a long time, Sarah. Synthetic guys are stubborn. If that pack is there, she's there. The cold preserves things, sometimes too well." He didn't mention the scavengers. He didn't mention the sheer violence of the avalanches that scoured the western faces of the High Sierra. He simply cinched his pack tight and threw it into the back of the Land Cruiser. Vala met them at the bay doors. He held a satellite phone and a laminated map case. "I've uploaded the coordinates to both your handhelds," Vala said, his usual laid-back demeanor replaced by a nervous energy. "I also ran a slope angle shading on the approach. It's nasty, Thorne. You're looking at 45 degrees of loose scree just to get to the base of the cliff band. Then it goes vertical. Class 4 climbing, maybe low Class 5, without ropes set." "We'll manage," Thorne said, taking the sat phone. "I'll monitor the frequency from here," Vala said. "Weather is holding for the next 18 hours. After that, a low-pressure system is moving in from the Pacific. You have a window, but it's going to slam shut by tomorrow afternoon."
"Then we drive fast," Thorne said.
The drive out of the valley was a blur of asphalt and heat haze. They took Highway 395, the spine of the eastern Sierra, watching the grey wall of granite rise up on their left like a fortress. Thorne drove with both hands on the wheel, his eyes scanning the ridgelines that knifed into the blue sky. For years he had looked at these mountains and seen a playground, a cathedral of stone. Today, they looked like a crime scene, a vast, complicit vault that had kept a secret for 11 years. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, the map spread over her knees. She traced the contour lines with a finger, over and over, circling the spot where Vala's pixel lived. "We walked right past it," she whispered, the road noise humming beneath her voice. "In the first week, the grid search. We were in the valley below." "We were looking for a hiker," Thorne said, keeping his eyes on the road. "Hikers stay on trails, or they fall into drainages. They don't climb technical spires in a whiteout." "She was scared," Sarah said softly. "She always climbed when she was scared. She thought height meant safety. If she got lost, she would have gone up, to see where she was." Thorne tightened his grip on the steering wheel. It made sense. A tragic, fatal kind of logic. In a whiteout, up feels like the only direction that makes sense, because gravity tells you where you are. But in these mountains, up often leads to a trap, a ledge with no exit, a spire with no descent. They reached the trailhead as the sun began to dip behind the crest, casting long, bruised shadows across the sagebrush. The air was already cooler here, thin and smelling of pine resin and dust. There were other cars in the lot, weekend warriors, peak baggers, but their objective lay miles beyond the trampled paths.
They geared up in silence. The click of trekking poles locking into place, the zip of gaiters, the heaviness of the packs settling onto hips. Thorne checked Sarah's harness, tugging the buckles, ensuring the fit was snug. She wasn't a rescue professional, but she had spent the last decade in these mountains, looking. She was fit, and she was driven by a fuel more potent than caloric energy. Thorne ordered. They started up the main trail, a wide, dusty thoroughfare that switched back through the manzanita. Their pace was punishing. Thorne set a rhythm that burned the lungs, a fast march designed to eat up the easy miles before the terrain turned against them. They passed a group of descending hikers who nodded tired greetings, oblivious to the grim purpose of the pair rushing upward into the deepening twilight. 2 hours in, the trees began to thin. The twisted, ancient foxtail pines stood like sentinels guarding the entrance to the alpine zone. The ground changed from dirt to granite slab. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 10 minutes as the sun finally vanished, leaving a sky bruised with purple and indigo. Thorne stopped at a bend in the trail marked by a cairn. He checked his GPS. Quote, 323, quote, he said. He pointed his pole into the darkness, toward a chaotic jumble of boulders that led into a narrow, shadowed throat of the mountain. It wasn't a route. It was a scar in the landscape, a drainage channel for snowmelt and rockfall. Into the wash? Sarah asked, adjusting her headlamp. Through it, then up the south flank. It's the only way to access that ridge without technical gear we don't have. They stepped off the hard-packed earth of the trail and into the loose, shifting reality of the wild. The silence was immediate and profound. No more sound of other hikers, no more rhythmic thud of boots on dirt. Just the clatter of stone against stone, the scrape of nylon, and the sound of their own breathing. The ascent was brutal. The wash was a choke of willow and talus, forcing them to scramble over car-sized boulders and push through dense thickets that grabbed at their packs. Thorne moved with a fluid grace, reading the terrain by the beam of his light, finding purchase where there seemed to be none. Sarah followed, stumbling occasionally, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she never asked to stop. By the time they broke out of the vegetation and onto the open scree slope, the moon had risen. It was a 3/4 moon, bright enough to turn the granite silver and cast ink-black shadows. The world was reduced to monochrome contrast. "Check in," Thorne said, pausing to drink. The water was ice-cold. "I'm okay," Sarah wheezed. She looked up at the looming silhouette of the ridge above them. "How far?" "Vertical? Another 2,000 feet? Linear? Maybe a mile. But it's going to be slow." The scree field was a nightmare of physics. For every 2 steps upward, they slid back 1. The slope was steep, hovering near the angle of repose, where the rocks were just waiting for a catalyst to slide. The sound was deafening in the quiet night, a constant grinding, clattering roar as plates of shale shifted under their weight. Thorne focused on his breathing. Step, breathe, plant pole. Step, breathe, plant pole. He tried not to think about what they would find. He tried to remain the technician, coordinate acquisition, asset recovery. But the memories of 2004 kept intruding. The helicopters banking in the wind, the dogs searching the valley floor, tails wagging, finding nothing. The look on Sarah's mother's face when he had to tell her they were suspending operations for the winter. "We failed because we didn't look up," he thought bitterly. "We looked at the map, saw a cliff, and said, impossible." They reached the base of the cliff band at 0200 hours. The air here was thin, sharp, and biting. They were at 11,800 feet. The wind howled through the notches in the rock, a lonely, desolate sound. Thorne found a small shelf of rock protected from the wind. He said. Sarah sank down against the granite wall. She pulled a protein bar from her pocket but didn't open it. She was staring up at the dark,
jagged line of the ridge against the stars. Vala said the pixel was at 12,400, she said. Her voice was steady now, hardened by the proximity. Yeah, that's 600 feet straight up.
Not straight, Thorne corrected, shining his light along the wall. There's a ramp system. See that diagonal shadow cutting left to right? It's a ledge system. It's narrow and it's exposed, but it's walkable. If she was disoriented, she might have seen it as a path. A path to nowhere, Sarah said. Thorne didn't reply. He stood up and checked his GPS again. The blue triangle of their position was agonizingly close to the waypoint Vala had marked. But in mountains, proximity on a screen meant nothing. 100 yards could take an hour. Thorne said. They tied in. The ritual of the figure-8 knot was grounding. Thorne checked Sarah's knot, then his own. The ramp was narrower than it looked from below. It was a slash of grey rock across the face of the precipice, covered in loose gravel and patches of old, hard snow. To their left was the wall, to their right, a drop that vanished into the darkness. Thorne moved deliberately. He tested every foothold. The wind plucked at his pack, trying to unbalance him. He could feel the tension in the rope behind him, a physical connection to Sarah's fear and determination. They climbed in a trance state, the world narrowing to the circle of their headlamps. Rock, snow, boot. Rock, snow, boot. After an hour of traversing, the ramp widened into a small bowl-like depression near the ridgeline. It was a hanging cirque, a scoop taken out of the mountain by some ancient glacier. It was isolated, hidden from the valley below and invisible from the air unless you were directly overhead. Thorne stopped. He checked the GPS. Distance to waypoint, 40 meters. He turned off his headlamp. 343. Sarah started. 344. Thorne whispered. 345. He waited. The silver light flooded the small amphitheatre. It was a stark, beautiful, terrifying place. Jagged spires surrounded them like the teeth of a crown. The floor of the depression was covered in large talus blocks and patches of persistent snow. 346. Thorne said gently. Sarah unclipped from the rope. 348. He looked at her. He saw the steel in her eyes. He nodded. They moved abreast, stepping carefully over the rocks. The silence was absolute. The wind had died down in this sheltered pocket. Thorne scanned the ground. He was looking for geometry. Nature makes chaos. Humans make lines. Straight lines, right angles, unnatural colours. He saw it. It wasn't a body, not at first glance. It was a hump of snow, slightly misshapen, tucked into the lee of a large boulder. But protruding from the ice was a corner of something that didn't belong. It was blue. Not the deep indigo of the night sky, and not the grey-blue of granite. It was electric cyan, the colour of the 90s, the colour of a nylon backpack that had faded but refused to disintegrate. Thorne stopped. He put an arm out, halting Sarah. She saw it too. A strangled sound escaped her throat, half sob, half gasp. Thorne said, his voice cracking. He moved forward alone, crouching by the object. He brushed the snow away with a gloved hand. The nylon crinkled, stiff and frozen. It was a Kelty pack. He recognized the model. He pulled the flap aside. The fabric was brittle, but it held. Beneath the pack, encrusted in rime ice and partially buried in the scree, was a shape. Thorne closed his eyes for a second, composing himself. He wasn't a searcher anymore. He was a witness. He turned back to Sarah. She was standing 10 feet away, her hands covering her mouth, shaking violently. "Sarah," he said softly. She took a step forward, then another. She fell to her knees beside the patch of blue. "Maya," she whispered. The name hung in the thin air. Thorne moved back, giving her space. He turned his attention to the periphery, scanning the area instinctively. He saw a trekking pole wedged between two rocks, snapped in half. He saw a Nalgene bottle, the plastic bleached white by the UV radiation of a decade, lying on its side. He looked at the position. She had found shelter.
She had tucked herself behind the largest rock, out of the wind. She had likely zipped her jacket up tight, pulled her knees to her chest, and waited for morning. A morning that never came. Thorne looked at his watch. 4:30. The eastern horizon was beginning to lighten, a faint ribbon of pale orange separating the Earth from the stars. He pulled out the satellite phone.
His fingers were numb as he dialed. Vala picked up on the first ring. "Thorne?" The voice was tinny, distant. "We're at the coordinates," Thorne said. He looked at Sarah, who was bowed over the blue nylon, her forehead resting against the frozen fabric, her shoulders heaving in silence. "And?" Vala asked. Thorne looked out over the valley, thousands of feet below, still submerged in shadow. "Target located," Thorne said. "Confirmed identification. We found her, Vala." There was a long silence on the line, then a heavy exhale. "Copy that. Do you need a hoist?" "No," Thorne said. "Not a hoist. We need a recovery team. Ground transport. It's delicate. I'll make the calls. Thorne?" "Yeah. Good work." Thorne lowered the phone. He didn't feel like it was good work. He felt the crushing weight of the 11 years she had sat here, watching the sun rise and set over the valley, while they had walked the trails below, blind and deaf to her silence. He walked over to Sarah and knelt beside her. He put a hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. She reached up and gripped his hand, squeezing hard enough to bruise. "She wasn't alone," Sarah whispered, her voice fierce. "She had the mountain. She had the sky." "She has us now," Thorne said. The sun crested the Inyo Mountains to the east. The first ray of light hit the jagged spire above them, turning the grey rock to burning gold. The light crept down the wall, inch by inch, until it reached the small depression. It illuminated the blue pack, the scattered rocks, and the two living figures huddled against the cold. Thorne reached into his own pack and pulled out a lightweight bivy sack. "We need to cover her," he said, "before the sun gets high, and we need to wait for the team." Sarah nodded, wiping her face. "I'm not leaving her." "I know," Thorne said. "Neither am I." He unfolded the sack. Together, they gently draped the silver material over the site, creating a temporary shroud, a barrier between the lost girl and the vast, indifferent universe. They sat there as the morning took hold. The wind picked up again, whistling through the crags. It was a harsh, unforgiving place, but in the growing light, the terror of the night receded, replaced by a somber stillness. Thorne looked at the map case, still clipped to his harness. He looked at the topographic lines, the dense cluster of contours that signified the cliff. He took a marker from his pocket and drew a small X on the spot. It wasn't just a pixel anymore. It was a place. It had a history, Thorne said, breaking the silence. Sarah looked at the horizon. Thorne admitted. Sarah closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the granite. She whispered. Thorne watched a hawk circling in the thermal updrafts far below them. The world was waking up. The hikers were starting their cars at the trailhead. The rangers were opening their stations. Life was continuing its relentless forward march. But up here, on this ledge at the edge of the world, time had finally stopped looping. The 11-year wait was over. The recovery had begun, yes, but more importantly, the waiting was finished. He sat back, keeping vigil, watching the sun climb higher, guarding the blue square that had been their beacon in the dark. Dr. Aris Vala dropped the heavy, ruggedized hard drive onto Marcus Thorne's desk with a thud that rattled the framed commendations on the wall. It was September 2016. The air in the Mono County Sheriff's Department was stale, recycled through vents that hadn't been cleaned since the first search for Elena Rossi failed 12 years prior. "That," Vala said, pointing a slender finger at the black brick, "is the entire Shepherd Pass region, down to the inch." Thorne looked up from his paperwork. He had aged. The hair at his temples was fully grey now, and the lines around his mouth had deepened into permanent grooves of skepticism. He didn't reach for the drive. Vala countered, pulling a chair out and sitting without invitation. Thorne leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking. Vala tapped the drive again. Thorne picked up the drive. It felt cold, heavy. Thorne plugged the drive into his terminal.
The work was not fast. It was a grind of pixel peeping that stretched from the autumn of 2016 well into 2017. Vala set up a workstation in the corner of the cold case unit, surrounding himself with 3 high-resolution monitors. The software divided the High Sierras into thousands of grid squares. Vala's job was to verify the algorithm's quote, 390 quote. Every time the computer flagged a cluster of pixels that matched the spectral signature of synthetic blue dye,
Vala had to zoom in and make a human judgment call.
Vala announced one Tuesday morning, rubbing his eyes. Thorne walked over, coffee in hand. On the screen, a blurry blue smear sat near the tree line at 10,000 feet. Thorne said immediately. Vala suggested. He cross-referenced the coordinates with the 2004 search logs. Thorne pulled the physical file. He flipped through the yellowed pages. Vala said, dismissing the alert with a keystroke. The months bled into years. The investigation became a rhythm of false positives. In early 2017, the system flagged a high-probability target near Bishop. Thorne spent a week chasing down a police report from 2006 regarding a woman matching Elena's description seen at a gas station. It was a ghost lead, a misidentified local with a similar gait. The hope flared and died, leaving the team back in the dark room,
staring at the satellite maps.
The primary difficulty remained the terrain itself. The High Sierra was a chaotic jumble of granite, scree, and shadow. At sub-meter resolution, a sun-bleached rock looked remarkably like a human skull. A shadow cast by a boulder looked like a sleeping bag. Vala tweaked the contrast, pushing the algorithm to be more aggressive, then dialed it back when the noise became deafening. Sarah Rossi said. She had come in to bring them lunch, a ritual she maintained to prove she hadn't given up. She stood behind Vala, looking at the jagged contours of the digital map. The wind up there doesn't just blow, it funnels. If she was caught in the blizzard, she wouldn't stay in the open, she'd seek a low point. We checked the depressions, Thorne said gently. You checked to ones you could see, Sarah corrected. Aris, can you change the angle? Look not from top down, but oblique.
Vala nodded.
I can try to drape the imagery over a 3D elevation model. It distorts the pixels, but it might show us the vertical faces. It was late 2018 when the breakthrough finally came. Vala was working the Tyndall Creek sector, an area north of the primary search zone. It was technically off Elena's stated route, but consistent with a hiker getting disorientated in whiteout conditions. He was applying a new contrast enhancement filter designed to highlight inorganic straight lines. Nature rarely created perfect right angles. Marcus, Vala said. His voice was quiet, lacking the triumph he thought he would feel. It was just clinical precision. I need you to look at Sector 7, Quadrant D. Thorne moved to the screen. The image was grainy, taken from a satellite orbiting 400 miles above the Earth. In the center of a chaotic field of grey scree, tucked deep into the shadow of a rock chimney at 12,000 feet, was a cluster of pixels.
They weren't just blue, they were electric blue, and they weren't round.
That's a hard edge, Thorne whispered, leaning in until his nose almost touched the glass. I ran the spectral analysis 3 times, Vala said. It's not ice, it's not mineral, it's nylon. And look at the shape. It's collapsed, flattened by snow load. But that triangular geometry, that's the corner of a tent. Thorne traced the line on the screen. It's wedged in a crevice. That's why the aerial searches missed it. From a plane, looking down, it's hidden by the overhang. You only see it if you catch the satellite angle just right. It's a gear cache, Vala said, or a shelter. Thorne straightened up. He looked at the coordinates. 12,000 feet. Steep terrain. Get the chopper records. We're going up. The 2020 recovery mission was not a hike. It was a tactical operation.
The altitude of the target site, the blue anomaly, as it was labelled in the briefing, made a ground approach dangerous and slow. Thorne authorized the use of a high-altitude A-star helicopter equipped with a hoist system. The morning of the extraction was cold and clear, the sky a piercing violet blue
that only exists above the tree line. Thorne sat in the co-pilot seat, headset on, listening to the rotor blades cut the thin air. Beside him, in the back, sat two SAR tech specialists and Elena Rossi. She had insisted. Thorne had not argued. "Approaching target coordinates," the pilot's voice crackled. "Wind is coming over the ridge at 30 knots. It's going to be bumpy." The helicopter banked, dropping over the lip of the Tyndall Creek basin. The landscape below was alien, a moonscape of shattered granite and lingering snowfields, even in summer. "Visual contact," Thorne said, his heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. There, in the shadow of the cliff, exactly where Vala's pixels had predicted, was a patch of unnatural colour. The pilot brought the bird into a hover. The downwash kicked up a cloud of ice crystals. Thorne watched the SAR tech, Miller, clip into the hoist. "Going down," Miller said. Thorne watched the monitor on the dashboard, which fed a live stream from Miller's helmet camera. The camera shook as Miller descended, spinning slightly. His boots touched the scree. He unclipped and scrambled up the loose rock toward the depression. "I'm at the site," Miller's voice came through, breathless from the altitude. "Confirmed. It's a tent. Sierra Designs. It's been shredded by the wind, but the poles are still anchored." Thorne held his breath. Sarah leaned forward, her hand gripping the back of Thorne's seat. "I'm clearing the debris," Miller reported. The camera view shifted as he pulled away rocks that had fallen over the last 16 years. He lifted a flap of the faded blue nylon. Static crackled. "I have a pack," Miller said. "Blue North Face. And I have remains." Thorne closed his eyes for a second. The 16-year knot in his chest loosened, not with relief, but with a heavy, final thud. "Secure the site, Miller. Prepare for extraction." The recovery took 2 hours. The wind fought them constantly. They loaded the gear first, the pack, the shredded tent, the trekking poles found wedged in the rocks. Then, with a reverence that transcended the roaring mechanics of the helicopter, they hoisted the body bag. As the helicopter banked away, turning back toward the valley floor, Thorne looked back at the rock chimney. It was just rocks again. The anomaly was gone. The mountain was empty. The forensic lab in Bishop was sterile, smelling of antiseptic and floor wax. It was a sharp contrast to the wild, chaotic wind of the high peaks. Thorne stood behind the glass partition with Sarah. "Doctor." Vala stood next to them, looking uncomfortable in the clinical setting. He was a man of maps, not bodies. The medical examiner, Dr. Liu, came out holding a clipboard. She looked tired. "We completed the dental comparison," Liu said, her voice soft but professional. "The records provided by the Rossi family match the remains recovered from Tyndall Creek. It is a positive identification for Elena Rossi." Sarah let out a breath that sounded like a sob, but she didn't cry. She just nodded, her eyes fixed on the covered form on the table beyond the glass. Thorne said. He walked over to a stainless steel table where the contents of the blue backpack had been laid out. It was a time capsule from 2004, a disposable camera, the film likely destroyed by cosmic rays at that altitude, a map disintegrated by moisture, and a small, water-swollen notebook. Thorne put on a pair of latex gloves. He picked up the notebook. It was a trail log. Most of the pages were fused together, pulp and ink bleeding into a solid brick. But the final entry, protected by the plastic cover, was legible. He read it aloud, his voice steady. Thorne placed the book down. He looked at Sarah. Thorne said. Sarah reached out and touched the plastic bag containing the notebook. Thorne agreed. Vala cleared his throat. 435. Thorne looked at the map on the wall of the lab. He took a black marker from his pocket. He found the Tyndall Creek drainage. He drew a solid black circle around the spot Vala had identified. 436. Thorne said, the formality of the code feeling like a benediction. He capped the marker. He looked at Sarah, then at Vala. The technology had worked. The persistence had paid off. The mountains had finally given her back. Thorne said. They walked out into the blinding afternoon sun of the parking lot. The Sierra Nevada range loomed in the distance, a jagged purple wall against the sky.
It looked the same as it always had, indifferent, beautiful, and vast. But for the first time in 16 years, when Thorne looked at the peaks, he didn't see a graveyard. He just saw a mountain. He unlocked his truck, the mechanism clunking loudly in the quiet afternoon, but he didn't climb in immediately. He rested his hand on the doorframe, feeling the heat of the metal seep into his palm, grounding him. Behind him, he heard the soft, rhythmic click of Sarah's heels on the asphalt, slowing and then stopping. Thorne turned. Sarah was standing by her sedan, her hand gripping the handle, but she wasn't opening it. She was staring back at the nondescript brick building that housed the county coroner and the forensics lab. It looked like a dental office or a municipal water department, not a place where 16 years of agonizing questions had just been answered with a devastating, silent certainty. "It feels wrong to leave her there," Sarah said. Her voice was thin, snatched away by a sudden gust of wind that kicked up dust from the valley floor. "I spent half my life looking for her, and now I'm just driving away." Thorne walked over to her. He didn't invade her space, stopping a few feet away, respecting the radioactive decay of her grief. "It's Sarah," whispered, looking down at her car keys as if they were alien artifacts. He thought and corrected her gently. He said, he was no life. He spot for the fire the world. Thorne corrected her gently, but with the firmness of a professional who knew the cruel arithmetic of survival. He saw the tension in her shoulders drop, just a fraction. It was a small mercy, a white lie he told the families, though in Elena's case, the position of the body suggested it was the truth. She hadn't been curled in the fetal position of agony. She had been sitting, waiting. Vala walked up behind them, shielding his eyes against the glare. He had swapped his lab coat for a windbreaker, looking less like a scientist and more like the tech-savvy climber he was. Vala said. Sarah nodded, a jerky, mechanical motion. She looked up at Thorne, her eyes wet but clear. Thorne said, she said. She reached out and squeezed Thorne's forearm, her grip surprisingly strong. Thorne didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. He watched as she finally opened her car door and slipped inside. The engine turned over, and she reversed slowly, tires crunching on the gravel. As she pulled out onto the main road, heading south toward the highway that would take her back to a life that had been paused for nearly 2 decades, Thorne felt a physical sensation of release, like a rucksack being dropped after a 20-mile hump. He turned to Vala. "You did good work with the LiDAR, kid. That anomaly. I've walked past that chimney 3 times in the last 10 years. I never saw the hollow." "The eye sees what it expects to see," Vala said, leaning against Thorne's truck. "The laser doesn't expect anything. It just measures the bounce. When we stripped the vegetation layer digitally, the rock formation looked unnatural, too symmetrical. It was the windbreak she built. The rocks were stacked. Nature doesn't stack granite slabs in a perfect semicircle." Thorne looked toward the mountains again. The afternoon light was shifting, casting deep shadows into the couloirs and ravines. "She built a fortress," Thorne murmured, "and it became a tomb." "Are you going to head up there?" Vala asked. "Where? The site?" "Yeah, recovery is done. The scene is cleared. But, usually, you go back up. To clean up the cairns, to decompress." Thorne shook his head. "Not this time. The chopper crew scrubbed the site. There's nothing left there but rocks. I'm going to the station. I need to file the 229 closure. Then, I'm going to go home, open a bottle of whiskey, and sleep for 12 hours. Vala smirked, a sad, knowing expression. "Bullshit. You'll be staring at the unsolved board by 8 p.m. "Go home, Vala," Thorne grunted, opening his truck door, "and delete the raw data. We don't need the coordinates leaking to curiosity seekers. Let the place go back to being wild." "Copy that. See you Monday, boss." Thorne climbed into the cab of his truck. It smelled of old coffee, pine resin, and the faint, metallic scent of gun oil. He sat there for a moment, listening to the engine idle, the vibration humming through the seat. He looked at the passenger seat. It was piled with maps, topographical quads of the Kings Canyon boundary, the Palisades, the Evolution Basin. The edges were frayed, the folds white with wear. He reached over and gathered them up.
He squared the edges, tapping them against the dashboard, and shoved them into the glove compartment. He wouldn't need them anymore. Not for Elena. He put the truck in gear and drove out of the lot, turning north onto Highway 395. The drive was a ritual in itself. To his left, the Sierra Nevada rose up like a barricade against the rest of the world. The peaks were jagged teeth biting into the blue sky. Mount Williamson, Mount Tyndall, Mount Whitney. From the valley floor, they looked two-dimensional, a cardboard cutout backdrop for a Western movie. But Thorne knew the three-dimensional reality of them. He knew the vertiginous drops, the scree slopes that slid like ball bearings under your boots, the thin air that tasted of ozone and ice. He rolled the window down. The air rushing in was hot and dry, smelling of sagebrush and heated asphalt. It was the smell of the Owens Valley, a smell that meant safety, civilization, and the lowlands. As he drove, his mind drifted back to 2004. He had been younger then, sharper maybe, but less wise. He had been a field lead for the SAR team when the call came in. A solo hiker, overdue. The storm had come out of the Pacific with a ferocity that caught everyone off guard. An October surprise. They had launched the birds, the Hueys and the Blackhawks, but the ceiling had dropped to zero visibility within hours. They had been grounded. He remembered the frustration, the impotent rage of standing in the command post, listening to the wind howl, knowing someone was out there. He had tried to push a ground team up the Shepherd Pass trail, but the snow was accumulating at 3 inches an hour. Avalanche danger spiked to extreme. They had to turn back at the tree line. Turning back is the hardest thing a rescuer does. It feels like betrayal. For 16 years, he had wondered if they had been close. If they had pushed just another mile, would they have seen a light? Would they have heard a whistle? Now he knew. They had been miles away. She had been on the other side of the ridge, hunkered down in a rock chimney, writing in a notebook while the world turned white. "Love you, Sarah. Love you, Mom." Thorne blinked, his eyes stinging. The road blurred for a second. He gripped the wheel tighter. She hadn't died alone, he told himself. She had died with her love. She had written it down to keep it safe. He pulled into the station lot 40 minutes later. The sun was dipping behind the crest now, the alpenglow beginning to paint the upper peaks in hues of violent pink and soft gold. It was the most beautiful time of day, and the most treacherous. The temperature would drop 30 degrees in the next hour. The station was quiet. The shift change had happened an hour ago, and the evening crew was likely out on patrol or dealing with the usual tourist incidents, heat exhaustion, twisted ankles, bear encounters. Thorne walked through the back entrance, the keypad beeping under his fingers. The squad room was empty, save for distinct pools of light from desk lamps. The hum of the servers in the back room provided a low-frequency soundtrack. Thorne walked to his office, a glass-walled cubicle in the corner that was more archive than office. His desk was a geological formation of paper, case files, budget requests, equipment manifests. But on the corkboard behind his chair, there was order. The cold board. It wasn't electronic. Thorne didn't trust screens for this. It was a corkboard covered in pinned photographs, maps and index cards. Each cluster represented a person the mountain had taken and refused to give back. There were 5 active clusters. He walked up to the board. In the center was the cluster for case 04-229, Elena Rossi, a photo of her at the trailhead, smiling, giving a thumbs up. She wore a blue beanie and an oversized fleece. Her eyes were bright, oblivious to the future. Next to the photo was a map of the search grid, covered in red hatching where they had looked, and empty white space where they hadn't. Thorne reached up. His hand hovered for a second, a tremor of hesitation running through his fingers. Taking it down meant it was over. It meant she was history. He pulled the pin holding her photo. The paper curled slightly in his hand. He looked at her face one last time. He whispered. He pulled the map. He pulled the index card with the case summary. He pulled the list of leads, the witness statements from other hikers who had seen her at the pass. He stripped the board bare of 2004. When he was done, the corkboard looked scarred, riddled with the tiny holes of the pins, a blank space in the middle of the tragedy. He sat down at his desk and opened the bottom drawer. He pulled out a thick, expanding file folder. He placed the photos and documents inside. He took a black marker and wrote on the tab, ROSSI. E. Recovered. 2020. He stood up and walked to the filing cabinets that lined the far wall. These were the, quote, 470 files, or the, quote, 471 files. They furthered that filing the files was files away that were locked in the files. They filing the files were 400 files. They cooked the 15 million possible. It set the end of the files had review the files that we trust them, pertail the files. They work that make us speak of remembers. He said that they wilt changed 2020. He stood up and walked one files. They weren't always solved, but they were finished. He yanked the heavy drawer open. It rolled on well-oiled tracks. He found the slot between Rodriguez and Ruiz. He slid Elena's file in. He pushed the files together, hearing the slap of manila folder against manila folder. He closed the drawer. It was done. Thorne slumped against the cabinet, exhaling a breath he felt he'd been holding since the Bush administration. The silence of the office pressed in on him. What now? He looked back at the cold board. There were still 4 clusters. Case 98 to 112. The pilot who vanished near Whitney Portal. Case 12-044. The trail runner who went for a morning jog and never came back to his campsite. Case 19-301. The child. Thorne walked back to the board. He stared at the child's photo. 6 years old.
Wandered away for a picnic area. They had found one shoe. Just one shoe. 3 miles up a drainage that a 6-year-old shouldn't have been able to climb. His eyes traced the contours of the map next to the boy's photo. They had searched the ravine. They had searched the forest. But they hadn't searched the scree field above the tree line. They had assumed the kid couldn't make it that high. But Elena had surprised them. She had built a wall. Maybe the kid had climbed. Thorne reached for the phone on his desk. He dialed Vala's number. It rang 4 times before Vala picked up. Thorne said, his voice scratching. There was a silence on the other end. Then, the rustle of Vala shifting in his chair. Thorne said, a sigh. Thorne said, 45, 46, 49. Thorne hung up. He didn't go home immediately. He went to the break room and poured the dregs of the coffee pot into a styrofoam cup. It was sludge, bitter and burnt, but the heat felt good. He walked out the back door of the station, into the fenced-in yard where the SAR vehicles were parked. The massive Ford F-550s, the snowcats covered in tarps, the ATV trailers. The sky was purple now, the stars beginning to puncture the darkness. The silhouette of the Sierra was a black rip in the horizon. He thought about the notebook again, the water-swollen pages, the ink bleeding. And she left this so we would know. It was the ultimate act of defiance, to leave a record, to say, I was here, I existed, I tried. Thorne took a sip of the terrible coffee. He looked up at the black mass of the mountains. They were indifferent, yes. They didn't care about Elena Rossi or the Miller kid or Thorne. They were geological facts, tectonic accidents. But the indifference was what made the resistance meaningful. Every step taken on a trail was a negotiation with gravity. Every breath at altitude was a theft from the thin air. Every survival story was a rebellion against the entropy of the universe. Elena had won. It took 16 years for the victory to be acknowledged, but she had won. She had stayed herself until the end. Thorne finished the coffee and tossed the cup into a trash can. He felt the fatigue finally settling into his bones, a heavy, leaden weight. He needed sleep. He needed to stop seeing ghosts in the topography. He walked to his truck. This time, when he got in, he didn't look at the empty passenger seat. He started the engine and drove out of the gate. He lived in a small cabin up Bishop Creek, halfway between the town and the high country. It was a liminal space, neither fully civilized nor fully wild. As he drove up the winding road, the temperature gauge on his dashboard dropped steadily. 80.
72, 65. He pulled into his driveway. The cabin was dark. He hadn't left a light on. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air was cool and still. He didn't turn on the lights. He navigated by memory to the kitchen, found the bottle of bourbon, and poured 2 fingers into a glass. He walked out onto the back deck. Below him, the creek roared, swollen with the same snowmelt that had once been the storm that buried Elena. The sound was a constant, white noise roar that usually helped him sleep. He sat in the Adirondack chair and took a sip. The whiskey burned, a clean, sharp heat. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again. He pulled it out. A text from Sarah. "I told Mom." She cried. Then she asked if she was warm. "I told her what you said, that she went to sleep."
"Thank you, Detective." Thorne stared at the screen. The blue light illuminated his weathered face, the lines around his eyes. He typed back, "She was strong. You should be proud." He set the phone down on the railing. He looked up at the sky. The Milky Way was a smear of diamond dust across the darkness. Somewhere up there, the satellites were orbiting, their electronic eyes scanning the Earth, measuring heat, measuring distance, stripping away the secrets of the surface. But they couldn't see everything. They couldn't see the will to survive. They couldn't see the love in a notebook. That required boots on the ground. That required a human hand to wipe away the dust. Thorne closed his eyes. He could see the map in his head, the contour lines, the elevation markers. He saw the spot where they had found her. And then his mind moved. It drifted north, to the scree-field below the diamond, to the spot where a 6-year-old boy might have climbed, chasing a bird, chasing the sky. Monday, he thought. He finished the whiskey. The mountain was still there, and so was he. The following week brought a different kind of storm, not of snow, but of bureaucracy and media. The press release had gone out on Tuesday morning, and by noon, the station's parking lot was filled with news vans. The mystery of the Sierra ghost solved, the chyrons read. Hiker found after 16 years. Thorne hated it. He hated the cameras, the microphones shoved in his face, the way they tried to turn a tragedy into a soundbite. He deflected most of it to the sheriff's public information officer, a young woman named Alvarez, who seemed to thrive on the attention. But he couldn't avoid the memorial service. It was held on a Saturday in a small chapel in Bishop. Sarah had asked him to come, she had said. So Thorne wore his dress uniform, the one that smelled of mothballs because he only wore it for funerals and commendations, and stood in the back of the chapel. The room was full. Hikers, locals who remembered the search, friends of the family who had driven up from Los Angeles. The casket was closed, of course. On top of it sat a framed enlargement of the photo from the trailhead, Elena smiling, the blue backpack slung over one shoulder. The service was simple. Sarah spoke. She talked about Elena's laugh, her terrible sense of direction in the city, but her unerring instinct in the woods, a bitter irony that made Thorne wince, her love for 90s grunge music. Then, an older woman walked up to the podium, Elena's mother. She was tiny, frail, leaning heavily on a cane. Her hair was white, but her eyes were the same dark, fierce color as Sarah's. She gripped the podium. Quote, 495, she said, her voice quavering but audible in the silent room. She looked out at the crowd. Her eyes scanned the room until they found Thorne in the back, standing in the shadows near the vestibule. She said, looking directly at him. Thorne felt the heat rise in his neck. He wanted to look away, to inspect his shoes, to vanish. But he held her gaze. He owed her that, she said. She began to weep, and Sarah rushed to the podium to hold her. Thorne slipped out the back door. He stood on the concrete steps of the church, loosening his tie, gasping for air. The smell of lilies and floor wax was suffocating. Outside, the air was hot and clean. He walked to his truck, stripping off his dress jacket and tossing it on the seat. He sat there for a long time, hands on the wheel, staring at the windshield. He repeated to himself. It was a powerful image, the end of the vigil. He started the truck. He didn't want to go back to the station.
It was Saturday. He was technically off duty. He didn't want to go to the cabin. He found himself driving west on Highway 168, climbing up out of the valley floor, past the reservoirs, past the aspen groves that were just starting to turn gold, mimicking the season when Elena had disappeared. He drove to the trailhead at North Lake. The parking lot was full of hikers preparing for weekend trips, brightly coloured gear, trekking poles, eager faces. They were checking their maps, adjusting their packs. Thorne parked in a, quote, 502 spot. He got out. He wasn't wearing his hiking boots, just his dress shoes and slacks, but he didn't care. He walked past the trailhead sign, Paiute Pass, 5 miles, Lamarck Col, 4 miles. He walked a few hundred yards up the trail until the noise of the parking lot faded and was replaced by the sound of wind in the pines and the rush of the creek. He found a large boulder by the side of the trail and sat down. He watched the hikers go by, a young couple laughing, a group of college kids with heavy packs, a solo man with a grey beard and a steady pace. He watched them with a mix of protectiveness and dread. They didn't know. They saw the beauty, the challenge. They didn't see the indifference. They didn't see the physics of the fall, the thermodynamics of the freeze. He wanted to stop them. He wanted to say, "Be careful. It doesn't care about you." But he stayed silent. He let them pass. Because that was why they were here, to test themselves against the indifference, to feel small, to feel alive. Elena had come for the same reason. Thorne reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a photocopy of the page from the notebook. He had made a copy before handing the original over to the family. He didn't know why. He unfolded it. October 18th, 2 p.m., whiteout. He read the words again. The handwriting was jagged, shivering. He took a lighter from his pocket. He held the flame to the corner of the paper. It caught quickly in the thin mountain air. The flame curled the paper, turning the words into black ash. Whiteout disappeared. Hunkering down, vanished. Love you turned to smoke. He held it until the heat nipped at his fingers, then dropped the burning fragment onto the rock. It flared out, leaving a smudge of grey ash. He brushed the ash off the rock with his hand. The wind caught it and carried it away, scattering it into the brush, into the creek, up toward the peaks. "Case closed," Thorne said aloud. He sat there for another hour, watching the light change on the mountains. He watched the shadows lengthen. He watched the day turn toward evening. Then his phone buzzed. He knew who it was before he looked. He pulled it out. "Vala, I ran the filter on the north sector, the scree field." Thorne stared at the screen. His heart skipped a beat, a heavy thud in his chest. "Vala, I got a hit. Synthetic reflection. 88% probability it's rubber, size of a small shoe." Thorne looked up at the mountains. The peaks were turning purple again, the beautiful, terrible wall. He typed back, "Send me the coordinates." He stood up. He brushed the dust off his dress slacks. He looked back down the trail toward the parking lot, and then up toward the high passes. The vigil for Elena Rossi was over. The light on the porch could be turned off. But there were other lights. There were other porches. Thorne walked back down the trail, his stride lengthening, his mind already calculating approach vectors, gear requirements, weather windows. He got into his truck. He didn't feel the fatigue anymore. He felt the cold clarity of the search. He turned the key. The engine roared to life. He checked the passenger seat. It was empty. He opened the glove compartment and pulled out the maps. He spread the topo of the evolution basin out on the seat beside him. Thorne said to the empty cab. He put the truck in gear and drove down the mountain, leaving the high country to its silence, but only for tonight. He would be back. He would always be back, because the mountain didn't care, but he did. And as long as he drew breath, as long as he could walk, he would not let the indifference win. Not completely. Not while he had a map, a compass, and a name to look for.